Welcome to History Teller YT, where forgotten voices and untold stories come alive. Today, we journey into the mountains of Mindanao to uncover the powerful and heartbreaking history of the Subanen people, guardians of rivers, forests, and sacred lands. For centuries, they lived in harmony with nature, honoring Mount Quinachuan as a sacred home. But in the last few decades, their world has been shaken by mining companies tearing into their ancestral mountains, by corruption and collusion that twisted the law, by harassment and violence aimed at silencing their leaders, and by the shadows of armed conflict that crept into their villages. This is not only the story of struggle and dispossession, it is also a story of resilience, culture, and defiance. You will hear of elders who stood against bulldozers, of families who endured displacement, of youth who turned to education and advocacy to keep their heritage alive. By the end of this history, you will see how the Subanen, though threatened from all sides, refused to vanish. Their voice continues to echo, a voice calling us to remember that progress without justice is destruction, and that defending the land is defending life itself. Stay with us. This is a history you cannot afford to miss. Long before the arrival of modern mining corporations and the turbulence of Philippine politics, the Subanen people lived quietly in the lush mountain ranges of the Zamboanga Peninsula. Known as People of the River, their name itself is derived from the word Suba, meaning river in the Visayan language. For centuries, the Subanen nurtured their identity through a deep relationship with nature. Rivers, forests, and mountains were not just resources, but living relatives, spirits that safeguarded their existence. Their ancestral lands stretched across the highlands, where shifting agriculture, hunting, and forest gathering provided food and stability. In their worldview, every stone, tree, and riverbank carried a sacred imprint, carefully guarded by rituals and taboos passed down across generations. This harmony, however, was never immune to outside forces. From the Spanish colonial era to American occupation, the Subanen were often pushed further into the uplands as lowland settlers took fertile valleys. Yet, despite marginalization, their traditions of the Gukom, their tribal judicial system, and the Dumalino dances, chants, and rituals of healing continue to thrive. By the mid-20th century, while modernization swept through Mindanao cities, the Subanen held firmly to their ancestral territories, unaware that even greater storms loomed on the horizon. These lands, rich in gold and minerals, would soon become a target for powerful companies and political elites, turning the Subanen into unwilling frontliners of one of the Philippines' longest indigenous struggles. To understand the pain of displacement that the Subanen endure today, one must first grasp the sacredness of their bond with land. Their worldview is anchored in the belief that Mount Quinachuan and the surrounding mountains are not just physical landmarks, but sacred guardians of life. Oral epics tell of spirits inhabiting rivers, whispering guidance to shamans during rituals. Each harvest was marked by Thanksgiving dances, while marriages and conflict settlements were tied to ancestral traditions, with elders acting as custodians of truth and fairness. This deeply spiritual culture made their communities remarkably resilient against waves of colonization. While other groups embraced new religions or assimilated into settler cultures, many Subanen chose to preserve their unique lifeways. However, resilience did not shield them from the slow erosion of their authority. As the Philippine state expanded, land titling systems ignored ancestral claims, labeling indigenous land as public domain. This bureaucratic theft laid the foundation for corporate incursions in later decades. The Subanen's way of life, once self-sustaining and shielded by geographic isolation, was now vulnerable to laws written without their voice. What was once harmony began to tilt toward conflict, as outsiders no longer saw mountains as sacred, but as mines waiting to be opened. By the 1970s and 1980s, Subanen communities began noticing unfamiliar surveyors marking boundaries across their forests. Government maps, once irrelevant to their oral traditions of land stewardship, now dictated ownership. At first, the Subanen resisted quietly, believing the government might respect their sacred spaces. Yet, as Mindanao grew to become the land of promise for settlers and investors, the Subanen's ancestral domains became prime real estate for commercial logging and, later, mineral exploration. While some neighboring Lumad groups faced immediate militarization, the Subanen lived in a fragile balance, neither fully targeted nor fully free. It was during this period that the seeds of the Canatuan mine were planted. Unknown to the Subanen, deals were already being struck in boardrooms far away, where companies like TVI Resource Development eyed their mountains for gold and copper. The calm of the Subanen's villages, filled with chants and harvest festivals, was about to be pierced by the roar of bulldozers and the language of legal documents they had never consented to. This was the quiet before their modern dark age, the last era when the Subanen still held unbroken dominion over their ancestral lands. By the early 1990s, whispers of mineral wealth beneath the Subanen Mountains were no longer confined to government reports or academic studies. Large mining firms, both local and foreign, began to circle like hawks over Zamboanga del Norte. For them, Mount Canatuan was not a sacred home, but a golden promise, a mountain rich with gold, silver, and copper veins that could be extracted for billions in profit. In the era of globalization, the Philippine government welcomed foreign investors with open arms, promoting a policy of liberalized mining under the Mining Act of 1995. This law effectively placed indigenous territories at the mercy of corporations, allowing vast tracts of land to be leased for extraction, regardless of ancestral claims. The Subanen people, who were rarely consulted in Manila's halls of power, suddenly found themselves facing decisions made in distant boardrooms. For them, no price could measure the value of their land, but to corporations like TVI Resource Development, their home was a commodity. The initial phases came with promises: roads, schools, clinics, and development. But behind these glittering offers lay bulldozers and explosives that would soon tear open the heart of Canatuan. The Subanen were unprepared for the scale of intrusion that was about to descend upon them, nor for the strategies of divide and rule that companies and local officials would use to undermine their unity. Mount Canatuan was not just another mountain. It was the seat of Subanen cosmology, the place where spirits resided, where rituals were conducted, and where harmony between humans and nature was reaffirmed. To cut open its soil was not only environmental destruction, but also cultural desecration, an act akin to tearing pages from their sacred scripture. Yet, despite this, TVI Resource Development moved ahead. The government issued permits without genuine free, prior, and informed consent, FPSC, a legal requirement under the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, IPRA. Instead of consulting the whole community, mining representatives allegedly negotiated only with select individuals or pressured leaders into compliance. Reports circulated of elders being bribed or intimidated into signing documents they did not fully understand. Many Subanen later claimed they were tricked into meetings that turned out to be recorded as proof of community consent. What followed was not only the clearing of forests, but also the dismantling of sacred sites where rituals had been held for centuries. Streams once clear turned murky with silt, while hunting grounds disappeared under mining debris. For the Subanen, these were not abstract losses. They were wounds to the soul. Each tree cut down was a relative. Each river poisoned was a silenced voice of the spirits. And yet, despite their appeals to government offices and agencies, the wheels of mining pushed forward, backed by powerful investors and politicians. The intrusion did not go unchallenged. From the moment the first machines arrived, Subanen leaders organized assemblies to voice opposition. The Gukum, their traditional judicial body, convened to deliberate the matter, and its ruling was clear. The mine violated the ancestral rights of the Subanen and must be stopped. The elders ordered TVI Resource Development to leave, and they demanded restitution for the destruction already caused. Yet, this tribal verdict, rooted in centuries of custom law, had no weight in the courts of the Republic. The Philippine judicial system recognized contracts and permits, not spiritual mandates. Still, the Subanen were undeterred. They staged protests, blocked roads, and sent petitions to national and international organizations. Some allies, church groups, NGOs, and environmental advocates amplified their cries, framing Conachuan as not just a Subanen issue, but a human rights struggle. The conflict grew heated, with confrontations between company security, police, and Subanen protesters turning tense and sometimes violent. Despite intimidation, the Subanen refused to yield their land without a fight. What was unfolding was not just a local dispute, but the opening act of a much larger tragedy. The collision between indigenous rights and the machinery of global capital. As the Subanen struggle against mining companies intensified, a new and insidious challenge emerged. Corruption in the very institutions meant to protect them. The free, prior, and informed consent, FPC, process, enshrined in the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, was designed to ensure that indigenous voices carried authority over decisions affecting their lands. But in practice, the process was repeatedly manipulated. Government agencies and company representatives often bypassed traditional leaders, choosing instead to work with local officials who were more willing to cooperate. In some cases, community meetings were staged with a handful of attendees, later presented as if they reflected the entire tribe's approval. Consent became a paper exercise, stripped of its spirit and legitimacy. For many Subanen, this betrayal cut deep because it was not only corporations at fault, but also public servants who swore to uphold indigenous rights. These practices left scars that went beyond politics. Trust within communities eroded because every signature, every handshake, and every promise could be a trap. What should have been a safeguard for their future became a tool for exploitation. It was here that the Subanen realized the struggle was not only against bulldozers and miners, but against an entire system tilted against them. The genius of exploitation has always been in the strategy of divide and rule, and the Subanen were not spared from it. As companies sought to expand operations in Conachuan, reports of bribery spread through villages. Certain elders or members of barangay councils allegedly received money, gifts, or promises of jobs in exchange for their support of the mining projects. This created a rift within the Subanen, splitting families and clans into those who resisted and those who accepted the company's offers. For the Subanen, whose strength always lay in unity and collective decision-making, this division was devastating. Families who once celebrated harvest festivals together found themselves arguing over whether mining was a curse or an opportunity. Younger members, lured by the prospect of wages, sometimes sided with the company, while elders fought to preserve ancestral traditions. These internal fractures weakened the capacity of the Subanen to present a united front. When they blocked mining roads, some neighbors quietly assisted company trucks. When petitions were raised, rival signatures surfaced in support of the projects. This tearing of the social fabric was as destructive as the environmental damage for a divided tribe was easier to silence. And yet, beneath the tension, a core group of leaders and elders refused to waver, insisting that no bribe could buy their sacred lands. Behind the scenes, the collusion between companies and government actors became increasingly clear. Local officials, instead of defending indigenous rights, often acted as facilitators for corporate interests. Licenses were fast-tracked, police escorts were provided to mining trucks, and dissenting leaders were branded as troublemakers or even terrorist sympathizers. At the national level, politicians emphasized the economic benefits of mining while turning a blind eye to grassroots complaints. For the Subanen, this was proof that the laws designed to protect them existed more on paper than in practice. International observers, from NGOs to human rights groups, began documenting these abuses, shining a light on how corporate profit was prioritized over indigenous survival. But even as reports reached Geneva and Ottawa, little changed on the ground. The Subanen's sense of betrayal grew sharper. Not only were their sacred lands being desecrated, but the very government sworn to uphold the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act was complicit in their dispossession. This collusion fueled a cycle of distrust and despair, reinforcing the reality that in the Philippines, power and profit often outweighed justice. Yet, the Subanen continued to resist, clinging to their traditions and their collective memory, knowing that surrendering their land would mean surrendering their soul. When the Subanen raised their voices against the desecration of Mount Canatuan, the response from powerful actors was swift and brutal. Leaders who dared to stand firm became targets of harassment, surveillance, and legal manipulation. One such leader, known locally as Bobby, an Indigenous Peoples Mandatory Representative, IPMR, stood as a strong critic of mining companies and complicit government officials. For his courage, he was slapped with a barrage of legal cases, charges that many recognized as fabricated. These tactics were not designed to convict him, but to exhaust him, drain his resources, and isolate him from allies. Beyond the courtroom, intimidation followed him home. His residence was attacked, at one point burned, sending a chilling message not only to him, but to the entire community. Opposition carried risks. Such harassment revealed how far the machinery of suppression could reach, using the law as both shield and sword to silence indigenous activism. For the Subanen, this created an environment of fear, where speaking truth to power meant living under constant threat. Yet, even amid this suffocating pressure, leaders like Bobby refused to back down, embodying a defiance that kept the movement alive. The threats did not always stop at intimidation. In one of the darkest chapters of Subanen history, violence erupted with horrifying consequences. Tribal elder Barlai Balais, along with his son, became victims of targeted brutality. Their murders were not only killings, but spectacles of cruelty, with mutilation meant to send a broader message. Locally, this act was understood not as random violence, but as calculated intimidation, a method to terrify the Subanen into submission and to accelerate the surrender of ancestral domains. The killings shook the community to its core. For the Subanen, elders were more than individuals. They were living repositories of tradition, wisdom, and continuity. To strike them down was an assault on the very backbone of their cultural identity. Fear spread through villages, with many asking, who would be next? Yet, despite this atmosphere of terror, the tragedy also sparked outrage. It strengthened the resolve of many Subanen leaders, who declared that no amount of violence would erase their claim to the land. In international circles, human rights groups began to highlight these murders as emblematic of the risks faced by indigenous peoples defending their territories. But on the ground, justice remained elusive as cases languished in courts or were buried under political pressure. What made these human rights violations even more unbearable was the silence of the state. While international observers condemned the attacks and NGOs documented evidence, the Philippine government often responded with denial or neglect. Police investigations stalled, suspects were rarely pursued, and officials downplayed the political dimensions of the violence. To the Subanen, this silence felt like complicity, an unspoken approval of intimidation as a means to push forward mining and other extractive projects. Harassment, assassinations, and arson became part of a broader landscape of repression, where indigenous defenders were painted as obstacles to progress. This systemic silencing was not unique to the Subanen, but reflected a wider pattern across Mindanao, where indigenous and peasant leaders were routinely targeted. However, for the Subanen, already marginalized and divided, the silence cut deeper. It confirmed their fears that appealing to state institutions for justice was futile. In the face of these dangers, traditional governance structures, international solidarity networks, and the courage of individual leaders became their only shields. The Subanen were learning a bitter truth. Survival meant relying on their own strength, because those in power had already chosen the side of profit. While the Subanen were already embattled by mining corporations and corrupt officials, another force intruded upon their ancestral domains: the New People's Army, NPA. This armed communist group, long active in the Philippine countryside, saw indigenous territories not as sacred homes, but as potential strongholds for their insurgency. Subanen villages, tucked away in the mountains, provided strategic terrain for guerrilla warfare. But for the people who lived there, the presence of armed rebels brought new anxieties. Tribal leaders began reporting threats from NPA cadres, who demanded food, shelter, and sometimes the recruitment of Subanen youth into their ranks. Families feared for their children, knowing that refusal could invite retaliation, while compliance meant losing the next generation to a war that was not theirs. The Subanen struggle had always been about preserving their land and culture, but with the NPA intrusions, they now faced the heavy weight of being dragged into a national conflict they never asked for. This further destabilized their governance, for elders and councils who resisted the rebels risked becoming targets themselves. The mountain that once gave them refuge was becoming a battlefield shaped by forces far beyond their control. Caught between mining companies, local officials, and now the NPA, the Subanen found themselves in an impossible position. The state branded them as sympathizers if they refused to cooperate with military offensives, while the rebels accused them of betrayal if they spoke to government troops. In some cases, armed clashes erupted dangerously close to Subanen communities, forcing families to flee their homes for safety. These displacements mirrored earlier struggles with mining projects, but now the threat carried the sharp edge of guns and ideological war. Women and children bore the brunt, abandoning farms and schools to hide in forests or seek shelter in lowland towns where they were treated as outsiders. Traditional councils, which had always managed conflicts through dialogue and ritual, were powerless against heavily armed groups. The Subanen's governance structures were designed for community balance, not modern insurgency. Elders lamented how decisions once rooted in consensus were now overshadowed by the looming presence of rifles. For the Subanen, survival meant carefully navigating a dangerous middle ground, a space where neutrality was punished, resistance was perilous, and silence itself could be interpreted as guilt. Perhaps the most devastating impact of armed intrusions was the erosion of the Subanen's traditional governance systems. The Gukum, once the final arbiter of disputes, lost authority when faced with outside groups who recognized no indigenous laws. Rituals meant to restore harmony were interrupted by the sound of gunfire, while sacred spaces became staging grounds for armed patrols. In this environment, younger generations began to question the relevance of their customs, seeing little protection in ancestral practices when modern weapons dominated their lives. This generational rift compounded the divisions already sown by mining and corruption. Elders feared that not only their land, but also their cultural identity was slipping away. In desperation, some leaders sought alliances with church organizations, NGOs, and human rights groups to strengthen their voice on the national stage. Yet, the heartache remained. Their internal governance, once the anchor of their society, had been fractured by forces they could not control. The Subanen were left to confront a sobering truth. The enemies threatening their survival were no longer just corporations or politicians, but the armed conflicts of the nation itself. Their ancestral domain, once a sanctuary, had become a contested frontier in wars of ideology, profit, and power. For the Subanen, one of the most painful challenges has not been the open aggression of mining companies or the intimidation of armed groups, but the crushing silence of the state. When elders and leaders submitted petitions, declarations, and ancestral claims to the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples, NCP, they expected protection under the law. The Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, IPRA, after all, promised recognition of ancestral domains, cultural integrity, and self-governance. Yet, time and again, these documents were met with bureaucratic inertia. Years passed with no resolution, no action, and no meaningful support. To the Subanen, it felt like shouting into a void. The state's neglect was not passive, it was enabling. By failing to act, government agencies left the Subanen exposed to the full force of corporate exploitation and political maneuvering. This institutional silence communicated a brutal truth. While the law existed, its enforcement depended on political will, and political will often bent toward the interests of the powerful. For Subanen communities, the absence of government protection deepened their marginalization, confirming that their rights existed only on paper, not in practice. The NCIP, tasked with defending the rights of indigenous peoples, often became a symbol of frustration rather than hope. Instead of providing swift recognition of ancestral domain claims, the process dragged on for years, bogged down in paperwork, conflicting jurisdiction, and endless verifications. For the Subanen, who lived in a world of oral traditions and ancestral stewardship, the demand for legal documents and technical surveys was alien and overwhelming. Villagers who lacked resources to hire lawyers or surveyors found themselves paralyzed in a maze of bureaucracy designed for urban elites. Worse still, companies exploited these delays. Mining firms moved forward with operations while ancestral claims sat gathering dust in government offices. This parallel disempowerment, where corporations advanced while indigenous petitions stalled, ensured that by the time recognition might finally come, much of the land was already destroyed or occupied. In this sense, bureaucracy became not a safeguard but a weapon, one that quietly eroded indigenous claims without the spectacle of violence. For the Subanen, the lesson was bitter. The machinery of government could rob them as effectively as the blade of a bulldozer. The cumulative effect of government neglect and bureaucratic delay was the creation of a cycle of marginalization. Subanen communities, already pushed to the peripheries by settlers and mining, now found themselves excluded from the very institutions that claimed to represent them. Requests for schools, health services, and infrastructure were frequently ignored, leaving them dependent on NGOs and church missions for basic needs. This dependency, while providing temporary relief, highlighted the state's abdication of responsibility. Over time, Younger Subanen grew disillusioned with government institutions, seeing them not as allies, but as obstacles. This mistrust hardened into resignation in some villages, where people stopped filing petitions altogether, believing that no resolution would ever come. And yet, in other communities, neglect fueled defiance, sparking alliances with environmental groups, church networks, and international human rights advocates. Through these partnerships, the Subanen found ways to amplify their struggles beyond the deaf ears of local officials. Still, the wound of abandonment remained. The Subanen were not only displaced by mining and armed conflict, they were systematically disempowered by the very state that was supposed to guarantee their protection. When the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, IPRA, was passed in 1997, it was heralded as a landmark law for Indigenous peoples across the Philippines. For the Subanen, who had long struggled against marginalization, IPRA seemed like the long-awaited recognition of their dignity and rights. The law promised to protect ancestral domains, guarantee self-governance, preserve cultural integrity, and provide access to services on equal terms with other Filipino citizens. For the first time in the nation's history, legislation explicitly acknowledged that Indigenous peoples were not relics of the past, but living communities with collective rights. The centerpiece of IPRA was the Certificate of Ancestral Domain Title, CDT, a legal document affirming Indigenous ownership over their traditional lands. In theory, this meant that mountains like Canatuan could never be taken without the free, prior, and informed consent of the Subanen. At the dawn of the new millennium, many Subanen leaders saw IPRA as a shield that would finally protect them from encroachment. Yet, as they soon discovered, the power of laws depends less on their words and more on the institutions that enforce them. What appeared as a promise of justice on paper quickly dissolved into frustration when confronted with the entrenched realities of corruption, patronage politics, and corporate greed. Despite the sweeping promises of IPRA, its implementation exposed a dangerous gap between legal protections and political realities. Mining corporations, armed with permits from the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, DNR, and backed by local officials, continued to operate on Subanen land even without genuine consent. The very government that had signed IPRA into law was often the same government that undermined it in practice. Subanen leaders who invoked their rights under IPRA found themselves facing endless delays, legal technicalities, or outright disregard. Courts favored corporations with access to lawyers and money, while Indigenous petitions languished. Worse still, the principle of free, prior, and informed consent, FPC, was reduced to a formality. Meetings staged, signatures extracted under pressure, and dissent silenced through bribery or intimidation. This betrayal revealed the limits of law in a political system where power often outweighed justice. For the Subanen, each broken promise deepened their disillusionment, reinforcing the painful lesson that written rights meant little without the courage of communities to defend them on the ground. At the heart of the Subanen's dilemma lies the broader structure of Philippine patronage politics. In this system, power flows through networks of favors, deals, and alliances rather than through impartial enforcement of the law. For mining companies, this meant cultivating relationships with politicians who could secure permits and suppress opposition. For officials, Indigenous communities like the Subanen were often seen not as rights holders, but as obstacles to be managed or manipulated. Even agencies like the NCP, created to safeguard Indigenous interests, were not immune to political influence. Cases of favoritism, internal corruption, and selective enforcement eroded trust in the very institutions that claim to represent Indigenous peoples. For the Subanen, This reality meant that every victory in law was precarious, constantly at risk of being overturned by powerful interests. Their ancestral lands were protected in principle, but vulnerable in practice. This clash between rights and realities has defined their modern history, forcing the Subanen to navigate a treacherous terrain where law is a double-edged sword, offering hope on one side and betrayal on the other. It is within this contradiction that their struggle continues, as they seek not only recognition, but genuine justice. The Subanen's ancestral domain was not simply a stretch of forest or farmland. It was a living archive of their spirituality and history. Mount Canatuan, revered as the center of their cosmology, became ground zero for a form of destruction that went far beyond economics. When mining operations dug into its soil, they tore into the very heart of the Subanen's identity. Ritual grounds were bulldozed, sacred streams diverted, and forests stripped of life. The mountain that once hosted chants and rituals now echoed with the sound of dynamite and trucks. For the Subanen, this was not merely environmental damage, but an act of desecration. Each blast was experienced as a wound upon their ancestors, each polluted river as an insult to the spirits who guarded their community. This cultural assault deepened the psychological trauma of displacement. Subanen shamans, once the mediators between the natural and spiritual worlds, found themselves powerless as sacred spaces vanished under debris. With the loss of their landscapes, the Subanen were not only losing homes and fields, but also their spiritual anchors, those intangible elements that gave meaning to life. In this sense, the destruction of Mount Canatuan was not just physical, it was cultural erasure. Before the mining companies arrived, the Subanen survival was rooted in a delicate balance with the land. Farming, hunting, fishing, and gathering forest products provided not just food but dignity, sustaining families in rhythms that stretched back for generations. When a mine expanded, these livelihoods collapsed. Rivers once teeming with fish became laden with silt and chemicals, driving families to hunger. Fields near mining sites grew barren, while forest animals fled the noise and destruction. Even access roads, often portrayed as development projects, served the company more than the community, carving up farmland and enabling outsiders to exploit resources. In place of self-sufficiency, the Subanen were offered temporary, low-paying jobs in the mines, labor that was dangerous and unstable, with little long-term benefit. Many who accepted this work found it came at the cost of their traditions and autonomy, trading ancestral knowledge for wages that barely sustained their families. As livelihoods eroded, so too did the Subanen's sense of control over their destiny. Dependency replaced independence, and poverty deepened in communities that had once thrived in harmony with their environment. In the end, the mining boom enriched corporations and elites, while the Subanen were left with scars, both on the land and on their way of life. Displacement did not only strip the Subanen of material resources, it also unraveled their cultural fabric. Traditional songs, dances, and oral histories were tied to specific landscapes, to rivers where rituals were performed, to forests where spirits resided, to mountains where ancestral stories unfolded. When these places were destroyed or rendered inaccessible, the cultural practices attached to them began to fade. Children grew up disconnected from the sacred geography that had once been their classroom, learning instead the language of mining and survival in hostile environments. Elders, who once carried authority as custodians of rituals, found their voices silenced by the intrusion of bulldozers and the lure of wage labor. Even community gatherings, once filled with collective celebration, became sites of tension as divisions over mining deepened. The result was a profound cultural void, a loss that could not be measured in pesos or hectares. For the Subanen, the destruction of their environment was inseparable from the erosion of their identity. Their survival was no longer simply about holding on to land, but about resisting the erasure of their culture itself. This realization fueled their resistance, giving them the conviction that defending the environment was not just an ecological battle, but a fight for their very soul. As Subanen leaders continued to resist, a disturbing pattern began to emerge: the criminalization of indigenous defenders. Instead of listening to their concerns, authorities often branded them as troublemakers, rebels, or even sympathizers of insurgent groups. Leaders who blocked mining roads or organized protests were slapped with charges such as trespassing, illegal assembly, or inciting unrest. These legal cases were rarely about justice. They were tools of harassment designed to exhaust leaders financially and emotionally. One striking example was the targeting of IPMR, Indigenous Peoples Mandatory Representative Bobby, whose courage made him a thorn in the side of both mining firms and local politicians. Court summons, hearings, and bail requirements became part of his daily life, draining his time and resources. The Subanen saw this as a deliberate attempt to isolate their leaders, forcing them to spend energy on legal battles instead of community mobilization. Criminalization also created fear among ordinary villagers, who hesitated to join protests for fear of being implicated. Through these tactics, the state and corporations managed to weaken resistance without resorting to open violence. Yet beneath the surface, resentment grew stronger. The Subanen knew that their leaders were not criminals. They were defenders of a heritage that stretched back centuries. Beyond courtrooms, intimidation was enforced on the ground by security guards, police units, and sometimes even paramilitary groups. Subanen communities reported checkpoints set up near mining sites, where residents were harassed or prevented from moving freely. Houses of known activists were raided or burned, spreading fear like wildfire through villages. Threats often came in whispers. Anonymous notes slipped under doors, messages delivered through intermediaries warning leaders to stop resisting if they valued their lives. In this climate of constant fear, daily life became suffocating. Farmers worried not only about their crops, but also about whether a visit from armed men would come at night. Mothers feared for their sons, knowing that outspoken young men were often the first to be targeted. This pervasive intimidation served a strategic purpose. It discouraged collective resistance, leaving communities too afraid to unite. Yet, even under this shadow, the Subanen clung to defiance. Ritual gatherings were still held in secret, petitions still circulated, and elders still spoke against exploitation. Fear may have spread widely, but it did not erase courage entirely. If anything, it revealed the extraordinary resilience of a people determined not to vanish quietly. When intimidation and criminalization failed, violence escalated into its most brutal form: murder. The killing of tribal elder Barlai Balives and his son marked one of the darkest moments in Subanen history. Their mutilated bodies, discovered after a targeted attack, sent shockwaves across the region. For the Subanen, this was not just an attack on individuals, but on their entire community. Elders embodied ancestral wisdom. They were the keepers of oral histories, the mediators in disputes, the custodians of ritual knowledge. To kill an elder was to strike at the heart of cultural continuity. The cruelty of the murders served as a message. Resistance carried a price in blood. Locally, people understood these acts as intimidation tactics meant to accelerate the surrender of ancestral lands. Internationally, human rights groups condemned the killings as part of a larger pattern of violence against indigenous peoples in the Philippines. Yet justice remained elusive. Investigations stalled, suspects went free, and families were left grieving without closure. The silence of authorities amplified the pain, confirming that the murders were not anomalies, but symptoms of a system that tolerated, even enabled, violence against the vulnerable. For the Subanen, the blood of their leaders became both a wound and a rallying cry, fueling their determination to continue the fight for their land and dignity. For the Subanen, one of the cruelest ironies of their struggle is that the very institutions created to defend indigenous rights often end up betraying them. The National Commission on Indigenous Peoples, NCP, tasked with implementing the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, IPRA, frequently failed to act with urgency or impartiality. Instead of standing as a shield, the NCIP was often accused of bending to the influence of politicians and corporations. Communities that submitted ancestral domain claims waited years, sometimes decades, for recognition, only to find mining permits already issued to companies in the meantime. Each delay deepened the suspicion that bureaucracy was not neutral but weaponized, serving as a silent accomplice to exploitation. While reports of abuse piled up, hearings were postponed, files misplaced, and communities left in limbo. This illusion of protection, where institutions claimed to defend indigenous rights but in practice facilitated their erosion, left many Subanen disillusioned with the state itself. The law promised them dignity. The institutions denied them justice. It was within this contradiction that the Subanen realized their struggle was not simply local, but systemic, tied to deeper failures of governance across the nation. Neglect is rarely passive. Often, it is a calculated form of governance. For the Subanen, petitions to halt destructive mining projects or investigate human rights abuses were frequently met with silence, neither approved nor denied. This bureaucratic limbo served the interests of the powerful. Mining companies could proceed unhindered while officials claimed they were still reviewing cases. For the Subanen, waiting became a political strategy imposed upon them, a slow erosion of hope through endless delays. Each unanswered request reinforced their marginalization, teaching communities that time was not on their side. Villagers began to interpret the inaction not as incompetence, but as deliberate complicity. This was most evident when local officials attended ribbon-cutting ceremonies for mining projects, even as petitions from Subanen leaders sat unanswered in Manila. The message was clear: development for the elite came before justice for the indigenous. In this climate, silence became a weapon as potent as violence, grinding down resistance without ever pulling a trigger. For the Subanen, the politics of inaction was a daily reminder that neglect itself was a form of oppression. Perhaps most painful of all was the realization that government institutions did not simply fail the Subanen. They actively enabled their dispossession. Police units, instead of protecting communities, were often deployed to escort mining trucks or disperse indigenous protests. Local officials, elected to serve the people, openly sided with corporations that promised tax revenues and campaign funds. Even national leaders, who spoke of protecting indigenous peoples in public speeches, signed agreements that paved the way for foreign companies to enter Subanen lands. This complicity was often disguised under the rhetoric of progress and development. Roads and infrastructure built for mining were presented as benefits to the community, even though they primarily served corporate interests. For the Subanen, these hollow promises carried a bitter taste. They saw schools without teachers, clinics without medicines, and projects that existed only on paper while their rivers turned toxic and their fields disappeared. Complicity thus wore the mask of development, hiding exploitation behind a language of modernization. The Subanen, however, were not deceived. They understood that what was being stolen was not only their land, but their future. Their resistance was not simply about preserving the past, but ensuring that generations to come would not inherit only ruins and broken promises. When the Subanen's struggle intensified in the late 1990s and early 2000s, their cries did not remain confined to the valleys of Zamboanga del Norte. Church organizations, missionaries, and local NGOs began documenting the abuses and reaching out to international allies. Reports of desecrated sacred lands and poisoned rivers reached human rights forums in Europe and Canada, sparking the interest of global watchdogs. Groups such as Mining Watch Canada, Survival International, and the Columban missionaries amplified the Subanen's voices, framing their plight as part of the broader struggle of indigenous peoples against extractive industries worldwide. For the Subanen, this solidarity was both a source of hope and a shield against total erasure. Knowing that their story was being told in Geneva, Ottawa, and Rome gave weight to their resistance. However, international attention was a double-edged sword. While it pressured corporations and governments to reconsider some actions, it also branded Subanen leaders as agitators backed by foreign interests. Still, these first echoes of solidarity broke the isolation that had long suffocated their fight. The Subanen were no longer alone. Their struggle had entered the global arena. Among the strongest allies of the Subanen were faith-based organizations and NGOs rooted in grassroots advocacy. The Columban missionaries, who had worked in Mindanao for decades, became vocal critics of the violence inflicted on Subanen leaders, especially after the brutal murders of tribal elders. Their statements reached national media, making it harder for officials to ignore the issue. NGOs such as IPO in Philippines and environmental advocacy groups provided training, legal assistance, and platforms for Subanen leaders to tell their stories. Workshops introduced communities to the language of human rights, helping them reframe their struggle not only as a local land dispute, but as a violation of international conventions. For a people long accustomed to oral traditions, these partnerships were transformative, equipping them with tools to engage bureaucracies and foreign audiences. Yet, the Subanen were careful not to let their voices be overshadowed by outsiders. They insisted that solidarity must not mean speaking for them, but amplifying their own testimony. This insistence kept their struggle authentically Subanen, rooted in their spiritual and cultural worldview, even as it entered global discourse. Despite growing awareness, the reality on the ground remained harsh. International condemnation rarely translated into immediate change. Mining corporations, protected by Philippine laws and shielded by political allies, continued operations despite global criticism. Statements from Amnesty International or reports submitted to the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, CRD, highlighted abuses, but enforcement mechanisms were weak. For the Subanen, this revealed the limits of international pressure. Global solidarity could shame governments, but it could not easily dismantle entrenched systems of corruption and collusion. Nevertheless, the symbolic power of international support should not be underestimated. It gave the Subanen moral strength, reassured them that their struggle was just, and occasionally stalled projects that feared reputational damage abroad. More importantly, it provided a historical record, evidence that what happened in Mount Canatuan was not hidden, that the world bore witness. For the Subanen, this was a small but vital victory. Their story was not erased, and their resistance had joined a global movement linking indigenous struggles from Mindanao to the Amazon. Despite the relentless waves of mining incursions, armed intrusions, and political neglect, the Subanen did not abandon their culture. In the face of destruction, they clung even more tightly to their traditions, seeing them not as relics, but as weapons of survival. Rituals once performed in wide-open sacred grounds were now conducted in secret clearings or inside homes. Whispered chants replacing drums to avoid drawing attention from armed groups. Storytelling became more urgent than ever. Elders gathered children at night to recount myths of creation, tales of ancestral heroes, and the moral lessons of their forebears. These oral traditions acted as lifelines, ensuring that even when physical landscapes were desecrated, the spiritual landscapes of memory remained intact. Subanen weavers continued to craft traditional garments adorned with symbols of rivers and mountains, asserting identity even as outsiders tried to erase it. Their music, though quieter, still echoed during small gatherings, binding them together in resilience. This persistence revealed a powerful truth. Culture, though rooted in land, can also endure through memory, ritual, and community bonds. The Subanen's survival was not only a struggle for territory, but for the preservation of the intangible threads that made them who they were. One of the quiet revolutions within Subanen communities was their embrace of education as a tool of resistance. While many government schools in remote areas were neglected, NGOs and church groups helped establish community-based education programs tailored to indigenous contexts. These schools not only taught reading, writing, and arithmetic, but also integrated Subanen culture, history, and traditions into the curriculum. Children learned not only how to navigate modern bureaucracies, but also why their land was sacred and worth defending. For elders, this was a strategy to prepare the younger generation for a dual battle, one in the courts and offices of government, and another in the forests and mountains of their ancestral domain. Some Subanen youth went on to pursue higher education in cities, returning as lawyers, teachers, or community organizers. They became bridges between tradition and modernity, armed with both ancestral wisdom and legal literacy. Education thus became a form of empowerment, countering narratives that painted indigenous peoples as backward or incapable. For the Subanen, every child who learned to read while still speaking their native tongue was proof that their culture was not vanishing but adapting, refusing to be silenced by oppression. What truly sustained the Subanen through decades of hardship was the spirit of collective resilience. Unlike individual struggles that often collapse under pressure, the Subanen anchored their survival in communal solidarity. Decision-making remained rooted in assemblies, where even in times of division, dialogue was pursued until consensus emerged. Rituals of reconciliation were invoked to mend rifts caused by bribery and coercion, reaffirming the tribe's unity. Women played a crucial role, not only in maintaining households during crises, but also in organizing community gatherings, preserving songs, and transmitting values to children. Men who once farmed now defended territories, while youth took up roles as documenters and messengers, ensuring that every violation was recorded and shared with allies. This collective spirit transformed suffering into defiance. Though scattered across villages and confronted by seemingly insurmountable forces, the Subanen never allowed themselves to be fully broken. Their resilience was not passive endurance, but active resistance, a conscious decision to continue being Subanen in a world that sought to erase them. Through song, story, and solidarity, they declared a truth louder than any gun or bulldozer. We are still here, and we will endure. As the Subanen realized that appeals to local officials often fell on deaf ears, they began to push their fight into the legal system. With the support of pro bono lawyers, NGOs, and church groups, petitions were filed to halt mining operations, challenge permits, and demand recognition of ancestral land rights. These legal battles were not easy. Courts were slow, procedures were complex, and corporations had teams of lawyers backed by vast financial resources. Yet, the Subanen saw litigation as an extension of their ancestral struggle, another battlefield where truth could be asserted. One of the most significant efforts came through invoking the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, IPRA, which guaranteed the right to ancestral domains. Leaders presented testimonies, maps, and oral histories, arguing that mining permits had been issued without genuine free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC. While many cases stalled or were dismissed on technical grounds, the very act of filing them was an assertion of dignity. It told the world that the Subanen would not vanish quietly, that they were willing to meet power in its own arena. Though victories were rare, each hearing and affidavit became a historical marker, preserving evidence of their resistance for future generations. Beyond the courts, the Subanen built alliances with environmental and human rights movements, recognizing that their struggle was not isolated, but part of a global battle against ecological destruction. Environmental activists framed the Quinachuan mine as a textbook case of how extractive industries devastate ecosystems and violate indigenous rights. Campaigns highlighted poisoned rivers, destroyed forests, and displaced communities, connecting the Subanen's plight with global debates about sustainability and climate change. This framing drew wider audiences, students, churchgoers, environmentalists, who might not have otherwise paid attention to indigenous struggles. Subanen leaders traveled to conferences, gave testimonies at international forums, and participated in solidarity networks. These alliances amplified their voice, making it harder for corporations to operate in silence. However, the partnership also carried risks. Government officials sometimes accused the Subanen of being manipulated by foreign NGOs, painting them as pawns of outsiders. Despite these accusations, the Subanen held firm, knowing that alliances provided not only moral support, but practical tools, legal advice, media coverage, and international visibility. Through these movements, the Subanen found both protection and affirmation, realizing that their defense of ancestral lands was also a defense of the planet itself. In the age of social media and digital networks, the Subanen's advocacy entered new frontiers. Younger members, many of them educated in urban schools, began documenting abuses with cameras and smartphones, uploading evidence to Facebook, YouTube, and advocacy websites. These digital testimonies reached far beyond Zamboanga, inspiring solidarity from activists in Manila and even abroad. Campaign hashtags demanded accountability, while online petitions circulated to halt destructive projects. For the Subanen, this shift marked a profound transformation, from a community long silenced by remoteness to one capable of projecting its voice globally. At the same time, digital advocacy also exposed them to new risks: surveillance, online harassment, and the labeling of indigenous activists as destabilizers or terrorist sympathizers. Yet, the benefits outweighed the dangers. Through modern advocacy, the Subanen were able to preserve stories that might otherwise have been erased, archive evidence of violations, and connect their struggle with global movements for indigenous rights. This blending of tradition and technology showed the adaptability of the Subanen spirit. Whether through chants and ancestral rituals or hashtags on the internet, their message remained the same. Our land is sacred, our rights are non-negotiable, and our struggle continues. Behind every protest, petition, and confrontation with mining companies lies a quieter, often invisible story. the toll borne by Subanen families. While leaders stood on the front lines, their households endured constant anxiety. Mothers feared for husbands branded as agitators, while children grew up watching their homes threatened by raids or their fields swallowed by mining debris. Families who once lived in relative security found themselves displaced, rebuilding shelters on the edges of forests or migrating to towns where they were treated as outsiders. This instability bred cycles of poverty. Children dropped out of school to help gather food or to escape harassment in classrooms where they were mocked for their indigenous identity. Women, often left to manage homes during crises, carried the double burden of nurturing families and sustaining resistance, cooking for protesters and caring for those injured in clashes. The cost of struggle was not only material, but emotional. The constant fear that speaking truth could bring violence to one's doorstep. Yet, even amid hardship, families stood behind their leaders. Their resilience ensured that the struggle was not only a matter of politics, but of survival, the defense of hearth, home, and heritage. The violence and displacement suffered by the Subanen etched deep scars into the psyche of younger generations. Children who grew up amid bulldozers, checkpoints, and assassinations internalized a reality where fear was constant. Many witnessed their elders threatened or killed, experiences that left emotional wounds long after the events themselves. This generational trauma manifested in multiple ways. Some youth carried anger, channeling it into activism, determined to continue the fight their parents had begun. Others, exhausted by poverty and conflict, withdrew into silence or migrated to cities, where they struggled with discrimination and alienation. The cultural void caused by displacement compounded this trauma. Deprived of sacred landscapes, young Subanen risked losing connection to rituals, songs, and oral histories that once grounded their identity. Without strong cultural anchors, the trauma of violence became harder to heal. Yet, within this darkness, there were sparks of resilience. Youth organizations emerged, blending modern advocacy with traditional knowledge, ensuring that trauma did not extinguish cultural pride. These efforts revealed a truth. Though trauma was inherited, so too was resilience. The youth carried not only scars, but also the seeds of renewal. Despite everything, the violence, displacement, and neglect, the Subanen continued to nurture hope for justice. This hope was not naive optimism, but a conscious act of resistance. Elders reminded communities that every struggle is part of a longer journey, echoing ancestral stories where survival came through patience, courage, and unity. Rituals of Thanksgiving were still held, even in small, hidden gatherings, affirming faith in the spirits that had guided their people for centuries. Advocacy victories, however small, fed this hope. Each international statement condemning mining abuses, each NGO report documenting violations, reminded the Subanen that their struggle was not forgotten. Most importantly, hope was embodied in the youth, in students returning from schools determined to defend their culture, in young activists who used cameras and social media to tell their story to the world. For the Subanen, hope was not abstract. It was a daily choice to continue farming, singing, weaving, and resisting despite the odds. It was the refusal to surrender identity, the insistence that their people's story would not end with displacement, but continue toward dignity and justice. The long arc of Subanen history in the modern era reveals more than a tale of dispossession. It is also a story of lessons for the nation and the world. The Subanen's experience demonstrates how laws, however progressive on paper, are meaningless without political will and genuine respect for indigenous voices. The Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act promised protection, Yet its weaknesses were exposed by mining incursions, bureaucratic delays, and corruption. Another lesson is the devastating power of divide and rule. How bribery and intimidation fracture communities, turning unity into suspicion. But perhaps the deepest lesson lies in resilience. Despite systemic violence, the Subanen never fully surrendered. They showed that resistance is not always dramatic battles, but also the quiet endurance of rituals performed in secret, the stubborn planting of crops on threatened soil, the unyielding telling of stories to children even when lands are lost. For the broader world, their struggle underscores the interconnection between environmental justice and indigenous survival. Protecting rivers, forests, and sacred mountains is not merely about biodiversity. It is about safeguarding cultures whose knowledge and traditions embody centuries of sustainable living. From the Subanen, we learn that the defense of land is inseparable from the defense of identity. What, then, is the moral of the Subanen story? It is that progress without justice is hollow, and development without consent is destruction. The mining companies and government officials who enrich themselves at the expense of Subanen lands stand as cautionary examples of what happens when greed overrides respect for culture and ecology. Violence, corruption, and neglect may bring short-term gains for elites, but they leave behind legacies of trauma, poverty, and environmental ruin. On the other hand, the courage of Subanen leaders, some criminalized, others silenced by violence, reveals the power of moral conviction. Their lives remind us that defending truth and heritage often comes at a heavy cost, but that cost also carries dignity. For young viewers and listeners today, the Subanen's struggle teaches the importance of questioning authority, protecting what is sacred, and standing with marginalized voices. In a world increasingly threatened by climate change, their moral call is clear: to honor the land not as a resource to be exploited, but as a living relative to be cared for. This moral, carved in both suffering and resilience, is what makes the Subanen story one of the most important indigenous struggles of our time. The Subanen story does not end with Kanatchuan, nor with the murders of leaders, nor with stalled petitions. It continues today in villages where children still learn their ancestral tongue, in gatherings where elders recount myths, and in advocacy campaigns that echo across the globe. Their journey is unfinished because justice remains elusive, but unfinished stories are also stories of possibility. The future of the Subanen lies in the balance between memory and renewal, remembering the sacrifices of the past while forging new strategies for survival. Alliances with environmentalists, human rights defenders, and faith-based groups continue to grow, expanding the circle of solidarity. Subanen youth, educated and tech-savvy, carry the fight into new arenas, ensuring their struggle adapts to modern realities without losing its roots. For the Subanen, every planting season, every song, every ritual is an act of defiance and continuity. And for us who hear their story, the invitation is clear: to stand with them, to learn from them, and to ensure their voices are not silenced. Their journey is not only their own. It is part of the larger human quest for dignity, justice, and harmony with the earth. You have just heard the story of the Subanen people, a tale of ancestral lands desecrated, of leaders silenced, of communities divided, but also of unbroken spirit and survival. We learned today how mining encroachment destroyed sacred landscapes, how corruption and collusion weakened communities, and how intimidation and even murder were used to suppress their resistance. Yet, we also saw how the Subanen held on, through culture, through education, through solidarity, and through their unshakable resilience. The moral of this story is clear. Land is not merely soil to be mined. but the lifeblood of a people. Progress without justice leaves only ruins, while true development begins with respect for culture and the earth. Here at History Teller YT, we share these stories so that voices like the Subanens are never forgotten. If this story moved you, subscribe and return for more journeys into the past, because history is not just about what was, but about what still shapes our world today. Until next time, may we listen, may we learn, and may we stand with those who fight to protect their heritage.